There's someone in your life right now who says yes to everything. Every request, every favor, every demand on their time, they agree. You might think they're just helpful, generous, maybe even admirable. But what if I told you that their inability to say no is actually a psychological prison, and the neuroscience behind it reveals something terrifying about how easily the human mind can be programmed to self-sacrifice until there's nothing left? Today, we're dissecting the dark psychology of people who can't say no, and the research we're about to explore will fundamentally change how you see compliance and boundaries. Let me start with a study that should immediately grab your attention. In 2016, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, published findings in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that examined what they called pathological accommodation. They found that people who chronically say yes to requests, even when it harms them, show distinct patterns of brain activity that are strikingly similar to individuals with impulse control disorders. But here's the disturbing part. While most impulse control issues involve difficulty restraining yourself from doing something you want to do, this involves difficulty restraining yourself from doing things you don't want to do. The impulse they can't control is compliance. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's actually happening in the brain when someone says no. Saying no is neurologically complex. It requires multiple brain systems working together. Your prefrontal cortex has to override social pressure and anticipate consequences. Your anterior cingulate cortex has to tolerate the discomfort of potential conflict. Your insula has to process the other person's disappointment without collapsing under the weight of their emotions. And your amygdala has to stay regulated enough that fear doesn't hijack the entire system. For people who can't say no, this neural orchestra is fundamentally out of tune. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience used fMRI imaging to watch what happens in the brain when people are asked to refuse requests. They compared individuals who could say no comfortably with those who reported extreme difficulty refusing others. The results were stark. In people who couldn't say no, making a refusal triggered massive activation in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, along with the anterior insula, which processes disgust and visceral discomfort. Their brain was treating saying no like a physical threat, triggering the same neural alarm systems that would activate if someone pointed a weapon at them. But why? How does someone's brain become wired to perceive self-advocacy as life-threatening? The answer takes us into developmental neuroscience and some of the darkest aspects of childhood conditioning. Research published in Developmental Psychology in 2019 followed children from age 3 through adolescence, tracking their ability to assert boundaries and refuse unreasonable requests. What they found was that children who grew up in environments where saying no was punished, whether through anger, withdrawal of love, guilt-tripping, or physical consequences, showed measurable changes in brain structure by adolescence. Specifically, these children showed reduced gray matter volume in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive control and decision-making, and increased gray matter in the amygdala, suggesting their fear circuitry had been overdeveloped. Their brain had literally been shaped by their environment to prioritize threat avoidance over self-protection. The very act of protecting themselves felt dangerous because in their developmental environment, it was dangerous. Let me introduce you to a concept that explains this perfectly. Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician specializing in trauma and addiction, talks about what he calls the authenticity attachment dilemma. Children are hardwired to need attachment to their caregivers for survival, but they're also born with authentic needs and boundaries. When those two things come into conflict, when expressing authentic needs threatens attachment, the child's brain makes a calculation. It sacrifices authenticity to preserve attachment because attachment is more critical for survival. The ability to say no gets traded away in exchange for connection. A 2020 study in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry examined this directly. They assessed children's boundary-setting abilities and their perceived security of attachment with their primary caregivers. The correlation was powerful and disturbing. Children with insecure attachment, particularly anxious attachment, showed significantly impaired ability to refuse requests, even from strangers. Their brains had generalized the lesson. Saying no threatens relationships, so never say no. This pattern, established in childhood, becomes a template for all future relationships. Now, let's talk about what researchers call rejection sensitivity. because this is the psychological foundation of the inability to say no. A comprehensive study published in 2017 in Personality and Social Psychology Review analyzed decades of research on rejection sensitivity and found that people who can't say no score extraordinarily high on rejection sensitivity measures. They're hypervigilant to any sign of potential rejection, and they perceive rejection in ambiguous situations where none exists. Their brain is essentially running a constant background program asking, "Am I about to be abandoned?" The neuroscience here is fascinating and dark. Research using event-related potentials, which measure electrical activity in the brain with millisecond precision, found that rejection-sensitive individuals show heightened neural responses to faces showing even mild disapproval as early as 200 milliseconds after seeing the face. That's faster than conscious awareness. Their brain is detecting and responding to potential rejection before they even know they've seen it. Saying no, which risks disapproval, triggers this entire threat detection system. A 2019 study published in Biological Psychiatry took this further by examining what happens neurologically in the moments before someone who can't say no is about to refuse a request. Using real-time fMRI, they watched participants' brains as they prepared to decline helping with a task. The results were striking. In the seconds before saying no, these individuals showed activation patterns consistent with anticipatory anxiety and pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes both social pain and physical pain, lit up like they were about to experience injury. Their brain was predicting that saying no would hurt, literally. But here's where the biology gets even darker. Let's talk about cortisol and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, your body's stress response system. Research published in Psychoneuroendocrinology in 2018 measured cortisol levels in people before, during, and after refusing requests. In healthy individuals, cortisol rises slightly during the refusal due to the social stress, then returns to baseline within minutes. In people who chronically can't say no, cortisol spiked dramatically and remained elevated for over an hour after the refusal. Their body was treating saying no like a sustained threat. Even more disturbing, the researchers found that these individuals also showed elevated baseline cortisol throughout the day, suggesting chronic stress. They measured salivary cortisol at multiple time points and found a flattened diurnal rhythm, meaning their cortisol didn't follow the normal healthy pattern of high in the morning and low at night. Their stress system was dysregulated, likely from years of living in a state of hypervigilance about others' needs and potential rejection. The inability to say no wasn't just psychological, it was destroying their endocrine system. Now, let me introduce you to research that reveals the social manipulation dynamics at play. A 2021 study in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology examined what they called exploitative request patterns. The researchers found that people who can't say no attract individuals who make increasingly unreasonable demands. It's not random. People who make exploitative requests are actually skilled at identifying those who struggle with refusal, and they specifically target them. The study used a clever design where Confederates made various requests of participants, and compliance was measured. Then, in a second phase, different Confederates were told to observe the participants and predict who would be most likely to comply with an unreasonable request. The Confederates were remarkably accurate, identifying the chronic yes-sayers based on subtle nonverbal cues like body language, eye contact patterns, and response latency. The people who couldn't say no were essentially broadcasting their vulnerability through micro-expressions and behaviors they weren't even aware of. This creates a vicious cycle. The person who can't say no gets targeted by more demanding people, which reinforces their belief that others will always ask too much of them, which increases their resentment and exhaustion. But they still can't say no because their fear of rejection is too powerful. They become surrounded by takers, while givers tend to drift away because the relationship feels unbalanced. Their social world becomes increasingly toxic, confirming their worst fears about what relationships require. Let's examine the research on what's called self-other boundary dissolution, published in 2020 in the journal Cognition. The researchers found that people who can't say no show impaired ability to distinguish between their own needs and others' needs at a neurological level. Using a task where participants had to quickly identify whether various needs were their own or someone else's, chronic compliers showed slower reaction times and more errors. Brain imaging revealed reduced activity in the temporoparietal junction, a region critical for self-other distinction. What this means is profound. These individuals haven't just learned to prioritize others' needs over their own. They've actually lost the neural clarity about where they end and others begin. Someone else's need feels like their need. Someone else's problem feels like their problem. Someone else's emotional state feels like their responsibility. The boundaries that allow healthy individuals to say, "That's not mine to carry," are neurologically blurred. They're living in a state of psychological enmeshment with everyone around them. A particularly dark study from 2019, published in the Journal of Personality, examined the long-term health consequences of chronic compliance. The researchers followed over 2,000 individuals for 10 years, tracking their boundary-setting abilities, health behaviors, and health outcomes. The findings were grim. People who chronically said yes to others' requests showed significantly higher rates of burnout, depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, and autoimmune disorders. The inability to say no was literally killing them. The mechanism seems to be multifaceted. First, there's the direct stress of overcommitment. These individuals are perpetually overwhelmed, having said yes to more than they can reasonably handle. Second, there's the opportunity cost. Time spent on others' priorities is time not spent on their own health, rest, relationships, or goals. Third, there's the physiological toll of chronic stress we discussed earlier. And fourth, there's what the researchers called self-betrayal stress, the unique psychological anguish of constantly violating your own needs and values. Research on self-betrayal is particularly illuminating. A 2020 study in the Journal of Counseling Psychology found that people who regularly act against their own values and needs show activation in brain regions associated with moral conflict and cognitive dissonance. Every time they say yes when they want to say no, they're creating internal conflict. Over time, this leads to what the researchers called value erosion, where people lose touch with what they actually want and believe because they've spent so long performing compliance. Now let's talk about the role of guilt, because guilt is the primary weapon that keeps people trapped in this pattern. A fascinating 2018 study published in Emotion examined what's called maladaptive guilt in chronic compliers. The researchers found that these individuals experience guilt not just when they actually harm someone, but anticipatorily before they've done anything wrong. The mere thought of saying no triggers guilt. Brain imaging showed hyperactivation in the medial prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, regions involved in guilt processing, even in hypothetical scenarios where refusing a request would be completely reasonable. The study identified what they called a guilt spiral. The person anticipates guilt if they say no, so they say yes. But saying yes leads to resentment, overwhelm, and failure to meet all the commitments they've made, which leads to actual guilt. So they're experiencing guilt either way, but the anticipatory guilt feels more controllable. They're choosing which guilt to experience, and they choose the guilt of overcommitment over the guilt of refusal, because at least that way they feel like they tried to help. Research on people-pleasing, published in 2021 in Clinical Psychology Review, provides another crucial angle. The researchers conducted a meta-analysis of 127 studies and found that chronic people-pleasers, those who can't say no, aren't actually motivated by generosity or kindness. They're motivated by fear and a desperate need for approval. When you remove the fear of rejection from the equation, their helping behavior decreases dramatically. This isn't altruism, it's self-protection through preemptive compliance. The study used various manipulations to test this. In one experiment, participants were told that the requester would never know whether they agreed or declined. Healthy helpers still helped at similar rates because they were internally motivated. Chronic compliers helped significantly less when their refusal would be anonymous. They weren't helping because they wanted to. They were helping because they feared the consequences of refusing. Remove the social consequences, and the helping disappears. Let me share research that reveals just how distorted these individuals' perceptions become. A 2019 study in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology examined what's called mind-reading bias in people who can't say no. The researchers presented participants with various scenarios where they declined a request and asked them to predict how the requester would respond. People who struggled with saying no dramatically overestimated negative reactions. They predicted anger, hurt, rejection, and relationship termination at rates far exceeding what actually occurred when the scenarios were enacted. The study included a clever follow-up where participants actually refused requests in controlled settings, and the researchers measured the requester's actual response. In 73% of cases, the requester responded neutrally or positively, often saying things like "no problem" or "thanks for considering it." But when asked afterward, the chronic compliers still believed the requester had reacted negatively, even when presented with video evidence to the contrary. Their perception filter was so strong that it overrode objective reality. They literally couldn't see evidence that contradicted their fear. Now let's examine research on what happens in relationships when one person can't say no. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Marriage and Family tracked couples over 5 years, assessing boundary-setting abilities and relationship satisfaction. The findings were counterintuitive for many people. Relationships where one partner couldn't say no showed lower satisfaction for both partners, not just the one doing all the complying. The partners of chronic compliers reported feeling like they couldn't trust what their partner actually wanted, feeling guilty for making requests, and feeling frustrated by their partner's passive resentment. The chronic complier creates what the researchers called relational ambiguity. Their partner never knows what they really want or need because the complier always says everything is fine, they're happy to help, it's no problem. This prevents genuine intimacy because intimacy requires authenticity. You can't truly know someone who never tells you no, who never reveals their limits or preferences. The relationship exists in a fog of false harmony that satisfies neither person. Research on the neuroscience of boundary setting, published in 2021 in Nature Neuroscience, offers insights into what's happening in the brain when someone successfully says no. The researchers found that healthy refusal activates the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, involved in value-based decision-making, and shows increased connectivity with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, involved in executive control. It's a top-down process where values and goals guide behavior, overriding immediate social pressure. In people who can't say no, this connectivity is impaired. Brain imaging showed that when they attempted to refuse requests, there was weak activation in these prefrontal regions and strong activation in the amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex. Instead of a values-driven decision, it was a fear-driven reaction. Their prefrontal cortex wasn't successfully regulating their limbic system. The fear was winning. Let's talk about cultural factors, because the research shows that culture plays a significant role in shaping the ability to say no. A comprehensive cross-cultural study published in 2019 in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology examined boundary-setting abilities across 47 countries. They found significant variations, with collectivist cultures showing higher rates of difficulty saying no compared to individualist cultures. But here's what's crucial. Even within collectivist cultures, there were individuals who could set healthy boundaries, and even within individualist cultures, there were individuals who couldn't. The researchers concluded that while culture provides the context and scripts around compliance and refusal, individual psychological factors still determine whether someone can say no. Cultures that emphasize group harmony over individual needs create more pressure, but they don't determine an individual's capacity for boundary setting. That's shaped more by early attachment experiences, trauma history, and personality factors. A disturbing line of research examines the connection between the inability to say no and vulnerability to abuse. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence found that individuals who struggled with refusal skills were significantly more likely to experience various forms of exploitation, from workplace abuse to financial manipulation to sexual coercion. The mechanism is straightforward. Abusers target people with weak boundaries because they can push those boundaries with minimal resistance. The study tracked participants' experiences over 3 years and found that those who underwent assertiveness training and improved their ability to say no experienced dramatic reductions in exploitative situations. It wasn't that the world became safer, it was that they stopped being selected as targets. Predatory individuals are remarkably skilled at identifying weak boundaries, and they move on when they encounter resistance. The inability to say no was functioning as a vulnerability signal that attracted exploitation. Now let's examine research on intervention strategies, because understanding the problem is only valuable if we know how to address it. A 2021 randomized controlled trial published in Behavior Research and Therapy tested what they called graduated assertiveness training for people who couldn't say no. The intervention involved starting with very low-stakes refusals, like declining a free sample at a grocery store, and gradually progressing to higher-stakes refusals over 12 weeks. The results were promising but revealed something important. Participants showed improvement in their ability to refuse requests, but their anxiety about refusing remained elevated throughout treatment and beyond. The researchers concluded that the goal isn't to eliminate the discomfort of saying no. The goal is to increase tolerance for that discomfort so it doesn't control behavior. It's not about making saying no feel good. It's about saying no even when it feels bad. Brain imaging before and after treatment showed interesting changes. There was increased activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during refusals, suggesting better executive control. There was also increased connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, suggesting better emotion regulation. But the amygdala activation itself didn't decrease significantly. The fear was still there, but the brain had gotten better at functioning despite the fear. Research on cognitive restructuring, published in 2020 in Cognitive Therapy and Research, examined the specific thoughts that keep people trapped in chronic compliance. The researchers identified several core beliefs. If I say no, people will hate me. Other people's needs are more important than mine. I'm only valuable if I'm helpful, and saying no makes me a bad person. These beliefs operate automatically, outside conscious awareness, driving the compulsion to say yes. The intervention involved teaching participants to identify and challenge these beliefs. But here's what the researchers found. Simply challenging the beliefs cognitively wasn't enough. Participants could logically understand that the beliefs were irrational, but they still felt true emotionally. What worked was behavioral experiments, where participants tested the beliefs by actually saying no and observing what happened. When reality contradicted the belief repeatedly, the emotional conviction in the belief began to weaken. A particularly innovative study from 2021, published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology, used virtual reality to help people practice saying no in a safe environment. Participants interacted with virtual characters who made various requests, and they practiced refusing while their physiological responses were monitored. The researchers found that after multiple VR sessions, participants showed reduced physiological stress responses to refusals in real-world situations. The mechanism seems to be exposure therapy. By repeatedly experiencing the feared situation, saying no, in a controlled environment where no real consequences occur, the amygdala learns that the predicted catastrophe doesn't materialize. The brain's threat prediction model updates. Virtual reality allowed for more repetitions in a shorter time than would be possible in real life, accelerating the learning process. Research on self-compassion offers another therapeutic angle. A 2020 study in the journal Mindfulness found that chronic compliers score extremely low on self-compassion measures. They're harsh with themselves, holding themselves to impossible standards of availability and helpfulness. Self-compassion training, which involves treating yourself with the kindness you'd show a friend, showed significant effects on increasing the ability to say no. The mechanism appears to be that self-compassion reduces the shame associated with having limits. When people develop self-compassion, they can acknowledge, "I'm tired, I've done enough, I need rest," without feeling like failures. They can recognize their own needs as legitimate, rather than as selfishness or weakness. This internal permission to have boundaries makes external boundary setting possible. Let me share one final study that brings everything together. Research published in 2022 in Psychological Science followed people who couldn't say no over a 10-year period, tracking their life outcomes across multiple domains. The findings were sobering. These individuals showed significantly worse outcomes in career advancement, relationship quality, physical health, mental health, and life satisfaction compared to matched controls. Their inability to say no was affecting every aspect of their lives. But here's the crucial finding. Those who underwent treatment and successfully developed the ability to say no showed dramatic improvements across all domains within 2 to 3 years of treatment. Their careers advanced because they could focus on their own priorities rather than everyone else's requests. Their relationships improved because they could be authentic about their needs and limitations. Their health improved because they could prioritize self-care. And their life satisfaction increased because they were finally living according to their own values rather than others' demands. The research is unequivocal. The inability to say no isn't kindness. It's not generosity or selflessness. It's a trauma response, a fear-driven pattern of self-abandonment that destroys health, relationships, and authentic living. It's a survival strategy from a time when compliance was necessary for safety, but that time has passed. The brain just hasn't updated its threat model yet. For those watching who recognize themselves in this research, I want you to understand something critical. You're not selfish for having boundaries. You're not mean for having limits. You're not a bad person for saying no. Those are lies that were programmed into you, probably when you were too young to question them. The truth is that boundaries aren't walls that keep people out. They're the foundation that allows genuine connection to exist. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you're teaching people that your boundaries don't matter. You're training them that your needs are negotiable while theirs are not. You're participating in your own exploitation. And I say that not to blame you, but to wake you up to the reality that you have more power than you think. The prison you're in has a door. You've just been told for so long that opening it is dangerous that you've never tried. The research shows change is possible. Your brain can learn new patterns. Your nervous system can learn that saying no doesn't lead to catastrophe. Your relationships can improve when you bring authenticity to them. But it requires something difficult. You have to be willing to disappoint people. You have to be willing to let them be uncomfortable with your boundaries. You have to prioritize your own well-being over their approval. And for someone whose entire identity has been built around keeping others happy, that feels like death. But it's not death. It's birth. It's the birth of an authentic self that's been buried under a lifetime of compliance. The science is clear. People who can't say no aren't living. They're performing. They're sacrificing themselves on the altar of others' comfort, hoping that if they give enough, do enough, help enough, they'll finally be worthy of love. But that's not how love works. Real love doesn't require you to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Real love says, I see your limits and I respect them. And anyone who doesn't respect your no doesn't deserve your yes.